Chris Reason from Channel 7. In July, we're obviously going to see a lot more money flow into the economy via the tax cuts from the federal government, and also potentially from the May budget, we're going to see a lot more handouts, etc., come through the community as well. How much does government policy actually prevent the RBA from being able to initiate a cut to rate hikes? Sure.
So firstly, on the stage 3 tax cuts, they're actually factored into our forecast. So that's something that's already in there. We've already taken account of it in our settings on monetary policy. It's true that monetary and fiscal policy need to work together in some sense, so you don't want them working at cross purposes. I would argue at the moment they are not working at cross purposes. I think the Treasurer has said very clearly, and he's publicly, and he's certainly said to me, that he's very conscious that they have to be careful that they don't add to inflationary pressures. As we've talked about before, I think in this forum 6 weeks ago, I mean, ultimately what's hurting people at the moment is inflation. And one response is to say, well, let's give people more money, but if it doesn't address the inflation problem, then it doesn't address the underlying issue for people. So I think basically at the moment that monetary policy and fiscal policy are pushing in the same direction. The only other thing I would add there is that, you know, governments have a difficult job. They've got lots and lots of competing demands on their purse and their policies. So, you know, I don't envy them their job.
Hi Governor, Millie Moreau from the Sydney Morning Herald. We've had 4 quarters of slowing GDP growth. So if GDP does turn negative, would the RBA have to consider a rate cut?
I guess the way I'd put it, Millie, is that what we've been trying to do, we've had a situation where aggregate demand has been above aggregate supply. So the demand for goods and services in the economy has been above the ability of the economy to provide it, and the big signal there has been services inflation has been one part of that. So with demand slowing, it's slowing and it's bringing demand back more into line with where the economy can supply the goods and services. So ultimately that will be positive for inflation, and when it is, then there are opportunities to consider whether or not policy can be slightly less restrictive.
Governor David Taylor, ABC. Are you worried about the Australian economy?
I'm worried about inflation. I am watching very closely what's happening with growth in the economy. As I said earlier, though, I think it's really important here to distinguish between levels and growth rates. As we came out of the pandemic, demand just exploded, and it was well above the ability of the economy to supply the goods and services. So the slowing is something that needed to happen so we could bring those two things back into. If our forecasts come true, and I really hope we're on that narrow path that Phil used to talk about, then we can slow the economy enough that it preserves a lot of the gains in employment and brings inflation down. And once we bring inflation down, then you'll see in our forecast period what's happening then is that real incomes start to grow again, consumption starts to improve again. So if we can pull that off, then I think that will be great. I still firmly believe that we are on the narrow path, and that's what the board is focusing on, that there are risks on each side. That's why the board is being cautious on rates at the moment.